The sun had barely dipped below the Zanesville skyline when Thomas Waddell eased himself into his worn recliner on the night of August 9th, 2023. At 66 years old, the grandfather with the easy smile and the calloused hands of a craftsman was simply enjoying the unhurried rhythm of retired life. He had no reason to be afraid. He had no reason to suspect that the woman sharing his home was, at that very moment, carrying a plan to end his life, a plan she had spent nearly a week preparing for. What investigators would slowly piece together in the days that followed was not just a murder, it was a masterclass in cold, deliberate deception, and the deeper they dug, the darker it got. Before we continue, take a moment to like and subscribe for more powerful real-life crime content. Turn on the bell icon so you're always notified about new cases, and drop your country in the comments. It's inspiring to see this global community seeking truth. Your support ensures these stories are never forgotten. Let's start. Thomas Wayne Waddell came into the world on July 20th, 1957 in Cincinnati, Ohio, the son of Thomas Sidney Waddell and Ruth Ellen Waddell. From the very beginning, he was the kind of person who defined himself through effort and generosity. After building a long career at Kroger, the national grocery chain where he'd given so much of his working life, Thomas had finally stepped away from the job and stepped into retirement. It was at Kroger years earlier that he had crossed paths with Deborah Frazier. Thomas was a proud father to 3 children, Olivia Denton, Jonah Waddell, and Cody Waddell, but nothing seemed to fill him up quite like being a grandfather. 7 grandchildren called him Grandpa, and every single one of them shared his inexplicable but endearing obsession with cowboy boots. Those who knew Thomas described him as the kind of man who never walked past a problem without trying to fix it. He was a handyman in the truest sense, a jack of all trades who transformed raw wood into furniture and friendship into something lasting. He loved hiking through the rolling landscapes of Ohio, disappearing into the trees with the same quiet contentment that he brought to his woodworking. Music was woven into the fabric of his days, particularly the sounds of Kenny Loggins and Dan Fogelberg, artists whose warmth matched his own. And come December, Thomas became something of a one-man Christmas operation, turning his home into a full celebration of the season with the kind of care and attention he brought to everything he touched. He had settled in Zanesville, a city of roughly 24,000 nestled in Muskingum County, about 50 miles east of Columbus. By the summer of 2023, Thomas was sharing his apartment at the Sandhurst complex with Deborah Lynn Frazier in what those around him understood to be an on-again, off-again romantic relationship. Deborah had been born on December 8, 1987, 30 years Thomas's junior. Most people called her Debbie. The two had met at Kroger, their professional lives overlapping before their personal ones did. To Thomas, she was a companion. To nearly everyone else in her life, she was something she had carefully constructed for them to see. And what Thomas could never have imagined was how thoroughly she had concealed her true self from him. 4 days before his death, on August 5, 2023, Deborah picked up her iPhone and typed a search query that would later become Exhibit A in the case against her: how to load a gun. She had never handled a firearm in her life. The next day, she went deeper. How to load a revolver pistol. Will a gun fire the wrong ammo? How to know what ammo your gun uses. These were not the casual curiosities of someone browsing the internet. These were the frantic research sessions of a woman preparing to do something she had never done before with a weapon she barely understood. Then came August 9th, the day Thomas would die. That morning and afternoon, Deborah searched how to uncock the hammer on a revolver and what does .22 ammo look like. Her final search of the day stripped away any remaining doubt about what she was planning. She typed, "Worst place to get hit in the head." Thomas kept several firearms in the apartment, among them a .22 caliber revolver he had purchased back in 1990, a weapon he was entirely comfortable with after decades of ownership. Deborah had never fired a gun. She had to learn from scratch, one internet search at a time. That evening, nothing would have appeared unusual to anyone passing by. Thomas settled into his recliner around 9 o'clock, perhaps watching television, perhaps simply sitting in the quiet comfort of a man at ease in his own home. He never heard her coming. Deborah approached him from behind, raised his own .22 caliber revolver, and fired a single bullet into the back of his head. One shot. No struggle, No warning, no chance. Thomas Waddell died in his favorite chair, killed by the woman he had trusted with his home, his heart, and his savings. But Deborah was not done. What followed was a calculated staging operation that revealed the depth of her premeditation. She wrapped Thomas's body in garbage bags and secured them with duct tape, then bundled everything in a comforter. Using Velcro straps, she dragged him from the living room into the bedroom. She tore apart photographs of the two of them and scattered the pieces around the apartment, manufacturing the visual signature of a violent home invasion. She turned things over, created disorder, not enough to truly simulate a crime scene, investigators would later note, but enough to tell a story. Or so she thought. There was another piece of Deborah's plan, and his name was John Anderson. Anderson was a man she had been secretly involved with for a full decade, 10 years during which he had no idea that the woman he was dating was living with another man as his romantic partner. Deborah had constructed an entirely fictional version of herself for Anderson. In his mind, Thomas Waddell was a frail, elderly dementia patient, and Deborah was his professional live-in caregiver. Approximately 13 hours after killing Thomas, Deborah reached out to Anderson. She said she was emotionally distressed and needed company. He picked her up at Sandhurst Apartments without question. Together, they drove to Dresden, Ohio, stopping at a BP gas station and spending time walking through the trails at Blackhand Gorge. At several points during their outing, Deborah slipped away from Anderson, telling him she needed private time to speak with a counselor. He noticed she was visibly upset, though she refused to explain why. Her behavior struck him as unusual, but Anderson had no conceivable reason, to suspect anything sinister. He believed he was supporting a grieving, overwhelmed woman through a difficult moment. He dropped her back at the Sandhurst Apartments somewhere between 11 in the morning and noon on August 10th. As far as Anderson was concerned, he had done the compassionate thing. He had no idea he had just handed Deborah Frazier her alibi, but before she had even called Anderson, before she had performed a single moment of her innocent victim act, Deborah made one more revealing search. At 8:16 that morning, she typed, "How long does GSR stay on skin? GSR, gunshot residue." She was checking the clock on the evidence left behind by firing a weapon. She was trying to calculate how much time she had. At 1:26 in the afternoon on August 10th, 2023, Deborah Frazier dialed 911. Her voice trembled with convincing urgency as she reported to the dispatcher that her apartment had been completely ransacked, the door left unlocked, belongings strewn everywhere, and her boyfriend was nowhere to be found, despite the fact that his truck sat untouched outside. The dispatcher urged her to back away from the building in case intruders remained inside. Deborah played along, telling the operator she was trying to move carefully through the space, unsure whether someone was still there. What the dispatcher could not see was the .22 caliber revolver, the same one that had already taken Thomas's life, now gripped in Deborah's hand. Then she screamed that she saw someone. The dispatcher immediately broadcast to all available units, "Active home invasion 3231 Sandhurst Drive," and then a sharp bang. A gunshot, unmistakable through the phone line. Deborah cried out that she had been shot, that she still hadn't found Thomas. She had fired Thomas's gun into her own leg. The response was immediate and total. Chief Scott Comstock arrived first on the scene, followed by Patrolman Brian Wolf and Logan Miller. Every officer on shift converged on the apartment. Patrolman Byron Bollinger knelt beside Deborah and applied a tourniquet to her self-inflicted wound while she cried out in real pain. She was transported to Genesis Healthcare System for emergency treatment. Her performance had been convincing enough that in those first moments, responding officers treated the scene as a genuine attack. It was Patrolman Logan Miller who walked into the bedroom and made the discovery that changed everything. Wrapped in garbage bags, bound with duct tape, covered in a comforter, the body of Thomas Waddell. Detective Brian Ruff assumed lead on what was now unmistakably a suspicious death investigation. Standing in that apartment, the contradictions were impossible to ignore. Despite the story of a violent break-in, not a single item of value had been taken. Multiple firearms, exactly the kind of thing any real burglar would grab first, sat completely undisturbed, and the supposed ransacking was, on closer examination, startlingly superficial. Detective Gary Moore began pulling security footage from homes and businesses surrounding the Sandhurst complex. If two masked intruders had fled the scene of a violent crime in broad daylight. Someone's camera had to have caught them. Frame by frame, the footage revealed nothing. Moore extended the search to every seat bus operating in the city that day. Again, nothing. The complete and total absence of evidence for the home invasion narrative was becoming its own form of evidence. And then investigators pulled Deborah's deleted search history. Detective Ruff walked into Deborah's hospital room at Genesis Healthcare System and let her talk. She described her day with Anderson in careful detail. The drive to Dresden, the walk at Black Hand Gorge, the return to find the apartment in chaos. She described the two masked intruders. She spoke of Thomas as if he were still alive, as if she had simply been unable to locate him amid the confusion. Ruff listened. He let her build the story brick by brick. Then he told her Tom was dead. He had been shot and killed. The composure crumbled. Deborah dissolved into tears, burying her face in the hospital blanket. Ruff watched every second of it. When the crying slowed, he leaned in and shifted the entire tone of the conversation. He told her to look at him. She wouldn't. When he asked whether she had any involvement in Thomas's death, she denied it flatly. Ruff had been doing this for 20 years. He had sat across from plenty of liars. He pressed forward. They had a search warrant for her phone. The color left Deborah's face. He had her searches, every one of them. And then the question that landed like a hammer. Why had she searched for how long gunshot residue stays on skin? At 8:16 that morning, hours before she had called 911 to report a home invasion she claimed to have just discovered, she had no answer. Her story shifted. Ruff told her they were done pretending. They knew she had shot Thomas with the .22. She denied it. He told her he had sat across from people who had killed multiple victims, and even they had eventually owned what they had done. Not her. And then came the forensic evidence that closed every remaining door. Her own hair had been found inside the garbage bag used to wrap Thomas's feet. When she tried to explain it away, claiming she had simply been near those materials at some point, Ruff's reply was direct. In all the years he had purchased duct tape, it had never once come preloaded with someone's hair, let alone hers. Deborah Frazier never confessed. Despite the searches, the physical evidence, the collapsed alibi, the logical impossibility of every version of events she had offered, she maintained her innocence throughout the entire interrogation. There was no crack, no moment of remorse, no flicker of recognition. It was one of the coldest performances Detective Ruff had ever witnessed. The investigation surfaced one more disturbing thread. Detective Moore had lifted fingerprints from a television that had been moved to the bedroom floor during the staged scene. When those prints ran through the database, they came back to a man named David Eugene Grantham of Tavares, Florida. The troubling detail: David Eugene Grantham had been dead since February 2021, the victim of an accidental overdose. The person who had found his body was his roommate. That roommate was Deborah Frazier. As investigators reconstructed Deborah's history, a pattern took shape that was both disturbing and clarifying. This was not a woman who had snapped under pressure. This was someone who had spent years cultivating a particular identity. The victim, the one in need of help, the woman people wanted to protect. In 2014, she had fabricated a false assault allegation. In June 2023, just 2 months before Thomas's murder, she had invented a story about being attacked by a man in a hoodie at Dillon State Park. She had gone so far as to create a fake phone number to send herself text messages, impersonating a BetterHelp counselor named Vivian. With Anderson, the deception was even more intricate. She had constructed a fraudulent email address imposed as a bank fraud investigator from PNC, manipulating Anderson into leaving voicemails for Thomas as part of an elaborate financial scheme. She had systematically drained the account she shared with Thomas, leaving behind just $2,000 of what had once been his retirement savings. When police spoke with Anderson and told him the full truth about Deborah's life, the man was completely undone. His girlfriend of 10 years had been living a double life. The elderly dementia patient he had heard about was, in reality, her romantic partner. On August 11th, 2023, one day after her 911 call, Deborah Frazier was formally charged with murder with a firearms specification, felonious assault, tampering with evidence, and domestic violence. Her bond was set at $2 million. On March 18th, 2024, Deborah appeared before Judge Marcy Flegel in Muskingum County Common Court. Rather than face a jury, she entered guilty pleas to murder with a firearm, specification tampering with evidence, and gross abuse of a corpse. Judge Flegel sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 23 years. Her earliest eligibility for release is August 7, 2046, when she will be 58 years old. Following sentencing, Assistant Prosecuting Attorney John Little spoke about the work that had brought the case to resolution. The investigation, he said, had demonstrated the depth of resources the county possesses when it comes to solving serious crimes. A disciplined, experienced detective bureau operating at its full capacity. What makes this case linger in the mind is not the murder itself, as horrifying as that act was. It is the architecture of everything around it. Most domestic homicides erupt from moments of passion, rage that overflows, confrontations that spiral beyond control. This was the opposite of that. This was methodical. This was engineered. 5 days of researching how to handle a weapon she had never touched. 10 years of sustaining a parallel relationship built on a completely invented version of herself. The construction of a fake home invasion, complete with torn photographs and strategic disorder. And then, while on the phone with a 911 dispatcher, the deliberate act of shooting herself in the leg to complete the illusion. That is not the behavior of someone acting out of desperation. That is someone who genuinely believed her own intelligence would carry her through. The exploitation of John Anderson over an entire decade remains one of the most unsettling elements of the case. For 10 years, he believed he was in a relationship with a compassionate woman who cared for vulnerable people. On the day she needed cover for a murder, he willingly drove her to the countryside, walked beside her, and dropped her off, never knowing what he was really part of. That kind of sustained manipulation requires a particular kind of mind, one that views other people not as individuals to be respected, but as instruments to be used. And through it all, even when the evidence was stacked around her like walls closing in, she never broke. There was no tearful admission, no moment where the weight of what she had done became too heavy to hold. Even seated across from a veteran detective who laid every piece of evidence before her, she looked ahead and kept lying. That is not guilt suppressed under pressure. That is the absence of something most people never realize they have. The question surrounding David Eugene Grantham has never been fully answered, and perhaps it never will be. A man dies of an accidental overdose. The person who discovers his body is Deborah Frazier. Alone, it might mean nothing. Against the backdrop of everything else investigators uncovered about her history, the fabricated attacks, the manufactured identities, the financial manipulation, the calculated killing, it refuses to sit quietly. What Thomas Waddell's case ultimately reveals is something both simple and devastating. Some people are extraordinarily skilled at appearing to be exactly what they are not. Deborah Frazier spent years perfecting the art of vulnerability, positioning herself as the one who needed protecting, the one who deserved sympathy and support. That positioning made her dangerous in a way that was nearly invisible until it was too late. Thomas deserved far better than the end he was given. He deserved to keep hiking Ohio's trails, building things with his hands, listening to his music, and watching his grandchildren grow up in cowboy boots. What ultimately brought Deborah Frazier down was not luck or coincidence. It was the thoroughness of an investigation that refused to accept the story she had so carefully rehearsed. Every deleted search query was recoverable. Every staged detail contradicted the next. Every lie she told created a new one she needed to tell. Her arrogance was the flaw inside the plan, in the unshakable belief that she was smarter than everyone who would come looking. She was not. And Thomas Waddell's family, at least, got to see that truth confirmed in a courtroom. The harder truth is this: she spent years among people who never saw it coming. Colleagues, romantic partners, a man who thought he was her devoted boyfriend, a man who thought she was his devoted companion. The mask held for a long time. It is a sobering reminder that the most dangerous forms of deception are the ones that never look dangerous at all. Thank you for watching and supporting the channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a comment. I love hearing your thoughts. Stay aware, trust your instincts, and stay safe. I'll see you in the next video.